hard,
That
but
was
it was crucial.
I remember
Sorry.
everything. Don't worry.
I start from the beginning.
No, I think we can just follow. I mean, we can read
Okay.
the.
This is what is termed minimalist ontology, ontology that studies beings, i.e. situations, as what they contain. The minimalist ontology defines beings extensionally, that is by what they contain, and not intentionally, that is defining them by their essential characteristics or their essences. There is no concept of essence in the minimalist ontology. In contrast, at the outset, it seems there is a shift introduced herein whereby the notion of a world carries with it particular transcendental operations that are specific to the world. Badiou says that mathematics and beings are one and the same thing. The famous formula in Being and Event says that mathematics is ontology, and how we have the new formula that mathematics is being. Badiou says that this equation, mathematics is being, follows the axiom of Parmenides. It is the same thing, same to think and to be. For Parmenides, the equivalence of thinking and being is a consequence of two originary theses that being is one and non-being is not. It is therefore impossible to think that which is not. What we think is what is. Furthermore, thinking isn't a being different from the being that is thought. Being is one. In another word, thought is not a being that thinks the being of what it is, of what is. From these theses, Parmenides concludes that Badiou calls the axiom that watches over his entire system, the axiom stating the equivalence of thinking and being. While this simple thought finds its utmost importance in Hegel, it is not the case that it was always a de facto axiom in all philosophy. For Descartes, thought was only one particular instantiation of being, i.e. substance. For example, it is with Hegel that the identity of thinking and being becomes a first principle of philosophy. For Hegel, being is first and foremost a thought. Being is a thought of being, and its determination is in and through thought. And while Badiou does not explicitly subscribe to the way this identity is proposed by Hegel in Science of Logic, he's fully committed to the consequences of this identity. There are particular instantiations of thought in being and events terminology, situations, and there is also thought itself beyond its instantiations, which when thought, it is nothing apart from the particular instantiation. One thought thinks its own thinking, and conditions under which thinking can take place, it is already instantiated. The being of thought is itself a situation that presents the rules of all other. So while it is justified to think that thought is more than the sum total of thoughts that exist, it is impossible to think thought beyond any instantiation. This for Badiou draws a perfect parallel between thinking and being. Being is the pure thinking that in every thought is always instantiated in a situation. For Badiou, thinking of pure thinking is then ontology that while itself a situation, because it is an instantiated thought, it thinks the conditions of all other situations, including itself, the instantiated thoughts. In this vein, one may understand Badiou's statement that mathematics is being in two senses. In the general sense that mathematics as a form of thinking is being, but furthermore, mathematics is being in the sense that mathematics sets out the conditions for all thinking, i.e. being.
Can I interrupt you, Reza? I was wondering about this proposition that, can you just scroll a little bit? Yeah. This proposition that within a situation of thinking that thinks itself, it gives the rules for all other situations. I mean, I'm not I think that I'm the least Badiouian among you guys, but for me this is kind of weird. I was my reading of being an event was that ontology is a particular situation that has a particular capacity of disclosing what it means to be a situation, in a sense, what it means to be actually, and to be being is always comes in situations when they are counted as one in presentation, if I'm not mistaken. So it is unclear for me what you mean, or maybe my interpretation is wrong. I don't know.
Well, actually, I agree with your interpretation, and I'm saying the same thing, I think.
Oh yeah, okay, because there is a phrase there that one situation because one now I missed the phrase. One thought thinks its own thinking and conditions under which thinking can take place. It is already instantiated. The thinking of thought is itself a situation. Okay, this is the perfect picture of what ontology is. It is something that thinks the possibility of other thoughts, but it is itself a thought.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
A situation that presents the rules of all other. This is true of ontology, but the phrase as it is, maybe I'm mistaken.
I thought that phrase was strange as well.
The phrase that it is, I thought it meant every situation, because they think their own thought, is disclosing the thought that is in every other situation, not just the ontological one. So this was my confusion. I don't know if I made myself clear. Do you understand, Reza?
I hear what you're saying, but I don't see the discrepancy with what is said here, because I am exactly saying what you are just explaining. So maybe later you can describe what the discrepancy is.
See if this correction would make sense for you, because you need to understand, Reza, Caron, the word rules for Caron mean a lot of stuff. They don't mean like what they mean for regular mortals like us.
Rules means the world for me. I mean,
yeah,
Stein and Salazar and rules. So everything is rule.
So when you say a situation that presents the rules of others, you mean the rules in the sense that they are also situations, not in the sense of their particularities.
Okay, this is a difference.
You see, now here. Okay.
Like I could rephrase something like every situation, as long as it is a thinking that thinks its own thought, presents as a property its own rules that is a common property to every other situation. Every other situation has its own rules. It's not that it presents the rules of the other situation, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, he just says ontology doesn't present anything, it just presents the structure of presentation. Yeah, in that sense, he talks about presentation in general, right?
Yeah, of course.
And by rule, I mean exactly that.
Yeah, the rule of presentation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Very good. Very good. Good catch, Caron. And I like the fragment you said, we mortal beings. So next paragraph, to this identity logic of words proposes to add one more strategic identity, that logic and appearing are also one and the same. And the transcendental names the crucial operator of this second identity. Furthermore, logic of word posits how the latter identity transforms a third identity previously proposed in being an event, that subject is a simple local determination of truth through an entirely originary theory of subject body. In similar fashion to the central thesis of being an event, mathematics is ontology, the thesis central to logic of words project, logic and appearing are the same, brings Badiou face to face with yet another strong and established tradition, the tradition among philosophers which, by asserting logic is the formal regulation of statements, have attempted to turn examination of language to the center of all thought, thereby consigning philosophy to fastitude grammatical exercise.
Yeah. This goes to our list of, Badiou's jabs on analytic philosophy. Hey, Gabriel. We are compiling a list. We are compiling a list of these jabs for an article, so we have to do that. But just because I started talking bullshit now, it is interesting that in your text, Reza, that you were mentioning that Badiou talks about an extensional, of course, because in set theory, it is the only concept of identity you can have is an extensional concept, right? And this is very similar to what concept of identity one can have, for instance, in Quine's philosophy or Goodman philosophy. They are all extensionalists in this sense. Just to punctuate this, just because it is something that is of interest for me and Gabriel, because we are writing something that goes there in this comparison.
It's interesting, guys. I was actually reading for something else, reading What There Is from Quine. It's quite an amazing text.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so this debate,
it's just a grammatical exercise from a small, lost tradition. I mean, couldn't this guy, like, he must be really bad at making friends. I mean, holy shit. Like,
but you, I don't think so. I think Quine is more difficult. I think Quine sounds like a more difficult guy to get along with. But anyway.
Scholastic quarrel between liberal grammarians and pious phenomenologists. I mean, yeah, good thing that nobody recognizes themselves in this. Like, yeah, those other grammarians and those other phenomenologists.
When you say grammarians, of course, I'm thinking he means Wittgensteinians and phenomenologists. I'm thinking he means because they are pious, you know, like post-Heideggerian variety of French phenomenologists like Michel Henry or Levinas, this kind of thing, right? But I may be wrong in my, you know.
I think he does.
Yeah.
In those guys.
Okay, let's go on.
This debate will no less be the debate over the place of philosophy, whose conservative interpreters think should belong to the university discourse, that in our era is marked by a scholastic quarrel between liberal grammarians and pious phenomenologists. Badiou's philosophy, which has oriented the thought of ontology in being an event, is now reorienting in logical world the thought of logic by establishing that logic in its usual linguistic sense is entirely reducible to transcendental operations. Logic of world aspires to the new science of logic, Badiou says, trying to measure up himself against the latter monument work of philosophy of all time. Logic for Hegel, as alluded above, is the very process of being in itself coming to appearance. In many aspects, logic of world has the same ambitions as science of logic, and similar to Hegel, who through his work shifted the understanding of logic to the journey through which being progresses to various stages of its moments, Badiou tries to put logic in a whole new disposition. Section 1, necessity of a transcendental organization of the situation of being. The first section.
Just before we go there, just to keep the ritual of annoying commentary. Things that I think are relevant. One thing, Reza, that you mentioned that I'm curious. I mean, you said that you wanted Badiou to write a extra chapter on the relation between presentation and appearance, right? Though I have the impression that it's, I mean, I'm kind of satisfied with the way that it's kind of it's kind of presented throughout the book. Because there is a weird indifference between the two things, all the way up to the sectional object, where then you need to mix the two together. But that is I mean, I'm mentioning this because I know that you have a project concerning comparing Zizek and Badiou, and this was, of course, the Hegelian Zizekian critique is, you don't have a theory of why being appears. It's like this monumental moment in Hegel's project is missing here because there's a weird kind of indifference between the two realms, right? And so I do think that your question, I mean, Zizek spilled a lot of ink over it and criticizing Badiou for it. When I was starting to read it, I also thought this was a problem. These days, I think that that's part of the greatness of the whole thing. It really shifts I mean, we get to that later, but the thing that I wanted to comment specifically is that it's two things. First, that I think we need to be careful. I mean, you mentioned that he provides us with a formula, mathematics is being, but I mean, it's an introduction. I don't think he never returns to this. Statistically, it's not really used in his work as a strong statement, and especially in the light of his latest comments on this whole thing, you can see that it has, I think at this point, I wouldn't say rhetorical value, but I think that much more important is the reference to the this and that are one and the same. This kind of Parmenidean gesture that you then reconstructed, Parmenides, Descartes, and Hegel, because it connects more clearly, I think, with this sort of, you give this really nice description of what follows from this statement. Being and thinking are the same in Hegel, and you mentioned Parmenides, and then you went into something that is very similar to Lazarus and Badiou, right? Badiou, I think, it's funny because there is one statement that is weird in his philosophy, and that's definitely derived from Sylvain Lazarou's work, is the idea that the hard thing is thinking a thought and not thinking being, right? First for Badiou, because he looked for the practice of thinking that has no object, or that has the least sort of objectification inside of it, to say that, well, if it thinks nothing in particular, it thinks only its own processes of thinking. Therefore, in mathematics, thinking and being are ultimately indistinguishable, right? And that actually is valid in a certain sense for for all the generic procedures, right? The process through which you're naming stuff is also the process through which you're constituting stuff. So that basic operation of the one and the same, like X and Y are one and the same, it's actually pulverized in Badiou. It's not an operation that is only valid for ontology. It is just something that we want to situate, right? There are procedures in which thinking and being are the same in a certain sense. The way that you work through the material of a situation is also the production of a new subset in the situation. So that's the theory of consistency in Badiou, which is also his theory of participation, is actually, I would say, the creation of a situated theory for this sort of procedure, right? Where thinking and being are the same. You're thinking art, but thinking art is also is also the consistency of something being, right? That's what we were talking about last meeting, that there is this weird thing about Badiou that follows from the idea that there are certain things that only consist insofar as you're thinking them, and that this doesn't really take away from their objectivity or their ontological status. On the contrary, that's what's hard to understand, right? So I find that Badiou gives a very kind of pragmatic, situated approach to this otherwise most abstract, most removed statement, right? That thinking and being are the same, because political thinking and political being are the same. An organization is thinking itself, and that's why it consists as a being. Once it's no longer in the dynamic of thinking itself, it's no longer the being that it was. And the same is valid for artistic experimentation and scientific experimentation. So you get localized instances where being and thinking are the same. It's not a privilege of philosophy, right? And in fact, philosophy falls under this meta project, which is, okay, how do I think a thought that has that structure? Which is very much Lazarus' own idea of anthropology, right? Because it's not about how to think what people are doing. It's about how to think what people are thinking. So you want to find a methodology to get in the mid of a dynamical process of self-constitution, right? So that in mathematics, thinking mathematically is also what makes mathematical structures. That has nothing to do with ontology. That has to do with mathematical practice. And the problem for philosophy is to think the thought that mathematics is thinking, right? So that's the weird kind of removal that Badiou does with regards to this. And I do think that he's making a rhetorical gesture when he says mathematics is being. Yes, we know from being an event that set theory can reduce itself to such a strict situation, as you call it, a minimal situation, where you only think through the consequences of belonging. But I do think that we shouldn't like expect too much from that statement, because it's not such a meaningful statement in Badiou's work, that mathematics is being. Of course, it is in the sense of this correlation, right? To think being, we use mathematics. To think appearing, we think with logic, right? But I just don't think it's useful to get stuck on this statement as a like overly important one, you know?
Yeah, but, you know, as I always say, I mean, your reconstruction is for, I mean, to my tastes is much more convincing than Badiou's text itself, which actually says stuff like being is mathematics is being, which is also different from mathematics is ontology, because ontology is not being. Ontology is a discourse on being. So either mathematics is being or mathematics is ontology, which are different things. So I mean, the most convincing way to put it within Badiou himself, I would say, is that mathematics is ontology, not that being is mathematical. Because if you say being is mathematical, or in a sense, you lapse back into some kind of Pythagoreanism or some weird physical stuff.
I agree, but I mean, I think that the good principle to reconstruct these things is two principles. The first, that you need to, Badiou's writing is way too dense. You need to dissolve it in his work. Like, statistical analysis of Badiou's slogans is useful to determine the slogans that are actually relevant from the ones that are just his prose like that. And I think that you can be ungenerous and get one statement out and say, look, this is absurd.
No, I'm not criticizing. I'm not criticizing your reconstruction. Actually, I'm praising it, because I mean it's much more convincing. But I think one is justified when coming to Badiou's text, you know, to being weary of such a formulation as mathematics is being, because, well, why? There's the justification for this is kind of weird in being an event, right? And the way you put it is much more clear that mathematics thinks while it thinks it is being, because it is the most empty form of discourse. So being the most empty form of discourse, it has a privilege over other kinds of. I'm using discourse, okay, because I'm a filthy analyst. But anyway, being the most empty in the sense of contents, of having specific contents, being the most empty discourse brings with it its privileges, that it can disclose certain forms of engaging that is proper to any situation at hand. I think this is a brilliant reconstruction, but I think it's not as clear if you read directly being an event, for instance. And he does use like he's saying the same thing when he says mathematics is ontology and mathematics is being, which I find highly problematic to say that both propositions, even if they are in themselves problematic, but use them both as meaning the same thing is like second order problematic, you know. So there's that.
Just to go back, if you read the actual statement in the book, it says, I have established that, then you open quotation marks, mathematics, quote, closes, and open, being, close, are one and the same once we submit ourselves to the axiom that it is the same to think and to be. It's a much, I mean, it's not like mathematics is being. This is not what he's saying at all.
No, but there's a different way of interpreting the Parmenidean idea that is like a substantial way of interpreting it. Like, you know, the reality has mathematical nature or something like that. Okay, I think if you come from ancient philosophy, if you come from a different tradition, if you don't come from, you know, maybe psychoanalysis, maybe places where in such, you know, emptied emptied signifiers are something you are familiar with, you are working with. This is rather, this sounds like a substantive quote, like a substantive, affirmation about reality. Of course, you have to read the whole book, and then you get to a different place.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think I think that the gossip is justified to a point. This is what I'm.
No, I'm not discussing that. I'm the first to agree with that. I just think that, I mean, there is a easy way out of this. Like mathematics is being, it's wrong, okay, sure, but I mean, there is a rhetorical use that is clear, which is mathematics will be to being an ontology as logics is to appearing and the transcendental. That's what he's establishing.
No, right? In the logic of worlds, yes, yeah.
In this section.
In logics of worlds, it's much clearer. I think much clearer.
And to me, this paragraph is actually about saying, look, I put mathematics in relation to being, I put logics now in relation to appearing, and I need to redo something which was a direct connection between truth and subject, because now this is mediated by something new, right? So this new equation actually changes something from the previous book. And I think that that's a much more profound change than from situation to world. Like the discussion of situation to world is actually quite compatible if you have certain sets and then you add structure to it. It's more of an additional step. Whereas the subject one, to the theory of the subject body, is not simply an additional one. Like from the whole machinery of the generic to the whole discussion on sheaves and blah, 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 there is more than just adding structure, right? So I think I like the fact that he points out that, look, this is leading to some different consequences than what I thought.
Yeah, and he's hinting at the fact that the logic of worlds is required by the fact that the whole is not one, and you don't have a complete totality.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if Reza will go through this thread in the book, but he's justifying the fact that you need a transcendental for a world because precisely you don't have the whole.
Oh, we
have to concretize the different situations in different worlds without totalizing them into what he calls a universe, right?
I wish I could read you guys my note on Hegel, because when you get to the chapter of Hegel, I think a lot of these conversations come together. I agree, obviously, with the construction that Gabriel is presenting. I more or less provided the same construction. I don't think that mathematics is equal to being, or mathematics is equal to ontology. It is crucial to what Badiou is trying to say.
Yeah.
Badiou systems. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Badiou's system is not hinging upon that, and it has created a lot of confusion than clarity in that regard.
Yeah.
I think bottom line is Badiou, as much as he hates this, but Badiou's, I mean, he comments, he admits this much we will see that here. In the style of Kant, he's taking some evidences very, very empirically. He's saying that we can think presentations. If we think that pure being is a pure multiplicity that has no, there is no evidence, there is no rational pathway for us to get from presentation, or to get from pure multiplicities to presentation, i.e. This is what amazing to me between Zizek and Badiou, because this question is very, very important for Zizek, that how is it that we have even presentation from pure chaos? Badiou's approach to this, the way that I'm reading this, the way that I read Zizek, this question is very important to Zizek. Badiou's approach to this is that there is no rational pathway for us to reach from pure multiplicity to presentation. But the fact that we can think presentation and the fact that the only access that we have to pure being is through presentation makes us to think, how is presentation possible? And what are the rules for presentation? And all he's saying is that I can tie presentation to pure being through the suture of empty set. Empty set sutures presentation to pure being, and thereby the rest of the set theory that I use in order to express the laws for how presentations behave. And what are the laws, like we said, what are the laws of presenting? The fact of presentation, however, is without proof. It is empirical fact. In here, to the same degree, I think what he's saying is, now we have established the relationship between pure being and presentation and established mathematics as what explains the laws of presentation. You're saying that there is no rational pathway for us for presentation to become appearing. We cannot say, we cannot discuss, or we cannot establish a generative view, a genetic view, I should say, or generative view from presentation to appearing. But the fact that we have appearing makes us to think that how is appearing possible? And in this way, the suture between appearing and presentation is the non-existence of whole. So to me, this is a perfect symmetry between what he's doing in being an event and logic of worlds. And that's the non-existence of world and the existence of transcendental is what sutures presentation to appearing, in my view.
It is very interesting because, yeah, I think that's a crucial point, right? That meditation too, of being an event, he does that whole twist to Plato and says, when Plato says that if the one is not, nothing is how you think multiplicity, right? Nothing is multiplicity, it's not the lack of multiplicity. That's what pure multiplicity appears like. So then he makes this jump to the empty set and so on. And I like this idea that the paradox of the whole is what gives the, let's say, this is how you arrive at the problem of the transcendental, because if you cannot have the totality in that sense, you need to have localized totalities. That's all. The concept comes from that paradox itself, right? It's nice because in Plato, you also come from the problem of the one and the multiple. If the one is not, nothing is, that would be an impasse, let's say. I cannot think the multiple without the one, and you arrive at the void, and you arrive at the transcendental from a similar paradox kind of situation. I like that symmetry.
Yeah, it's very interesting because he picks on two dialogues from Plato in order to establish this transition. And it's basically saying the relationship of one and many is the transition between pure being and presentation, and the idea of difference is the transition between presentation and appearing. So in both cases, it is a Platonic kind of development in philosophy that he's hinging upon. Now, either he's reading too much into Plato or not, but he's presenting a very compelling or symmetrical argument here.
Yeah. You know, I'm more and more thinking that in the end of the day, Badiou is then empirical Platonist, because we're finding that there is actually a big space for empirical evidence. I don't know when he talks about the two being an interpretation. No. But there's a book by Bartlett called Education by Truths that discusses only Plato, and I think on the footnotes he goes through this. But I find it amazing that there is actually an I mean, we discussed this last time, this particular place that evidences that there are such things as these procedures of consistency, true thought, right? He does require you to, just asks of you to acknowledge that this is out there, and that this reorganizes a lot of the categories. And I think that there is something similar to this with the problem of, because if you were to deduce, I have no idea what that means, but if you were to deduce, because the problem in the end of the day is that there isn't really, philosophy is a very small thing in this whole thing for Badiou. And the idea, for example, that things like Hegel or Zizek want, which is the deduction of appearing from being, things like this that are general and universal, is way too much, right? As Badiou says it, I think in the next section that we're going to read, there is no general theory of difference in the sense of how to specify a being. It needs to be specified locally. And I think that the whole point is, of course, you can discuss how something comes to appear in a given world. That exists. That's the question that the whole book deals with, right? Things appear in a given world in a certain way. And there's a whole process about it. The book is basically about this. Something didn't exist in a world. How can it come to exist? But the idea that this question can be answered generally, philosophically, abstractly, without concrete means, makes no sense in his philosophy. I think that's where the distinction comes from. Zizek, Schelling, Hegel, they all kind of sublimated political, artistical, scientific kind of questions into philosophy. Then they want abstract answers to these problems. Badiou sets things up in such a way that you have concrete local answers. Like, you want to know how in science you can produce the emergence of something in terms of appearing that didn't appear, now it appears. We can answer that. But I think he deactivates a bunch of these archy questions about the appearance of appearance as such, right? Those questions are emptied out, because if philosophy was able to answer them, philosophy would be saying something true. And for Badiou, philosophy has nothing true to say. It only organizes truths from other discourses. So, for example, a certain science can come up with the perceptive system of humans, and we understand exactly how it is that our sensory organs came to be and how they're coded and registered in neurons and so on. Well, that would be a scientific process studying how it is that this particular concrete situation appearance happened. But you never get the question in that general sense, right?
Should we continue?
Maybe we should continue the questions talking about comparison between presentation and appearing. I mean, being and appearing, but maybe we should just continue a little bit to have more.
Yeah.
This just to answer him very quickly. He has a theory of this. This is the whole problem of the object in the next big book, book 3.
Book 3, yeah.
Yeah, because that's when you are going to see what is the retraction, both the support of appearing in being and the retraction of appearing back onto being. But I was just thinking about if it was a holography, and I wouldn't know how to.
What I was trying to say with that a little bit is like that boundary bulk thing in some like string theory particle physics. It's like where you have a boundary where it's coded.
What is a boundary bulk?
So it's just like a similar split that seems like Badiou setting up in Logics of Worlds, where like the boundary is where everything's encoded, but you don't experience the boundary directly. But and I'd call that like the mathematics of being for Badiou. And then the bulk is where like things actually occur that are either measurable or observable. And there's like the same way that there's support sets in the Transcendental throughout Logics of Worlds, like the bulk has to connect to the boundary, but they don't work exactly the same way.
Man, the only that's really cool. I'd love to read more about this, but it's like you're trying to make something clearer by going to something more complicated. Like,
At least to us.
yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
sure.
you're
No, I
so
understand
stupid
that.
on this. Like, please, I really want to understand this better. But you see a similarity then between like a analogy between this structure, boundary bulk constructions in string
Or
theory.
even if you just think like general like a hologram, like holography, like you have like the information encoded at this sort of base level that you can't experience at all, and then it gets projected, and the projection for Badiou, I'd say, would be coming through the transcendental into like what's experienced directly. Like like I don't know if you would agree that it seems like being for Badiou is something like, yeah, you can't experience directly, that it's almost in this like withdrawn world of sorts.
I see. Yeah, no, I don't think that that's exactly the relation. I mean, the first thing I think I mean, of course, I don't understand enough what you're talking about to be able to make any meaningful comments. But from what I understood, I mean, just from common sense, my stupid understanding of holograms and things like this, the problem is that I think the first thing we need to have in mind when approaching both being an event and logics of worlds is that Badiou doesn't turn to mathematics in the sense to understand the real world better. The whole point of mathematics for him is that you get to see, let's say, rather than have a theory that has that is modeling something in reality, so you have a black box in reality and you have your theory. Mathematics is good for Badiou because you have the black box and the theory both made of the same thing. So situations are the black box, states of situations, mathematics, model theory is the theory or the space of theories. So you get to see both and how they react in this kind of toy way. And you're not interested in connecting that directly to the world. You're interested in seeing what sort of dynamics are thinkable between those things. And not even saying that if you found one dynamic, it is the real dynamic. It's simply that if somebody tells you later on, this is unthinkable, you will say, no, I just thought it here. Look, you can see how these things could match in that way. So there is, I think this is really weird, but it will later on be very useful because though he uses some stupid examples and some corny examples and things like this in the book, there's actually not that much commitment to the real world in any of this. I mean, he wants to give a definition of the relation between transcendental and world and so on, so general that it could fit the most absurdly weird things that we could even imagine. And second, because we remain within this toolbox where everything is homogeneous with each other, we never need to assume inaccessibility. And he goes to the point of doing what when I first read the book, I thought it was like absolute obscenity, which was to say, you know, we're going to stay not with Kant, but with Mao Zedong. Like, nothing is unknowable. What we don't know will come to know. Like, there's absolutely nothing inaccessible by essence for him, or that's subtracted in the sense of unthinkable in that sense. So the good thing about coming to logic of appearance and transcendental in this way is that we're always seeing both sides. So the idea that something was left in a sort of inaccessible world and then something is projected to us from that inaccessibility, we never get to have that inaccessibility because we're simply talking about sets with added structure, and this added structure in that set, it wouldn't make sense to talk about one thing being removed from us, right? That's kind of, let's say, the trade-off that his ontology and his whole project kind of asks us to accept. Look, I'll give you perfect clarity. You simply will never be able to directly think it models anything. So you'll see how transcendentals relates to order structure that relates to the relation between beings and objects, and all of this becomes like clarified, but then you ask, okay, what works like this? or what is this exactly in reality? And you never get a good answer to that. Like, you get different operations on top of this. So the reason why I'm saying this is that you nowhere in this book do we get a sense that, for example, being is removed and all we get is appearing. Because especially, and that's the whole point, that he wants to show that, of course, in experience, the being of an artistic process seems removed from the author. And what am I doing with this painting? What is paint, and can I access it? But from a different perspective, which is not yours, not from your experience, you have total access, thinking has total access to that being, to the point that it's actually participating in it, meaning it's constituting it. It's simply not your perspective, right? So there is actually nothing that is inaccessible in that sense. It's a weird kind of direction, I think. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with what you were asking, but it just reminded me of this point that I think is relevant, because I could see this being imagined, or I personally like the image of, okay, we have this, let's say, underlying set, and then we add some, we extract something from it in a projection, and we get a sort of spatial localization of this set all of a sudden, right? But I think that this metaphor comes with added commitments that we might not want to have. I'm not sure.
That's good.
But yeah, just.
I wouldn't be saying that the being was inaccessible to thinking itself, but just the necessity for this split between being and appearing, which I think I remember in like the book previous to the Mathematics of the Transcendental, like with the necessity to go to category theory and how it dealt directly with relations as opposed to just sort of categories of belonging.
Yeah.
Which I don't know, I got the sense throughout this book, like the necessity of that, having that support set within the being of this situation. I'm not sure if I'm using the terminology right.
You have to have like a support for the operation of appearing at the level of being. This is what you're hinting at, something like that.
Yeah.
You have to have some multiples, some set supporting the operations of the appearing.
So I don't want to bog down in this because I know we're focused on one section here. But I guess my question would be: Does being ever appear itself as such in this book? And if there's not an answer to that now, it's probably something I'll be having in my head throughout reading it.
Definitely, I think
there is a retroaction towards being, like afterwards, like book 3, book 4 and 5. You have theory of points and things like that, when he thematizes the relationship between multiples as qua multiples, that is being qua being, and the appearances that they support, in a sense, so to speak, like in a commonsensical way, in a commonsensical part.
But look, just to give a brief, I don't think we need to go that far. Like in this section, he will use that, which I think it's funny because he uses the opera as an example, and I find it kind of corny, but then the numbering of the pages, I find it like a much better example. And he says, look, you know, that the page 220 follows from page 219. It concerns the being of these numbers, but the level of proximity that we assess in a book between page 219 and 20, because they're part of the same argument, or one page ends a chapter and then begins a new chapter, so they're very different, right? That concerns the particular world of the book. But would you say that you're not thinking number just because numbers are caught up in the transcendental of the book? No, you're thinking them. So you do have access to the being of numbers, like properties of prime decomposition, or succession, all sorts of mathematical operations that concern the very being of those numbers and the singularity of those numbers in that kind of Ramanujan way. All of them are valid. So there's nothing hidden in appearance. And this is what I think it's actually, this question is also very useful as an introduction, because when I read Mathematics of the Transcendental, is that I understood the mathematics in being an event, let's say the pragmatic aspect, because Badiou begins Mathematics of the Transcendental with, look, somebody told me that this other thing is good for doing other stuff. So we're gonna see how it goes. And then he does the other stuff and he says, yeah, okay. And then he goes back and says, okay, we can work it in this other way. It works well, let's stick with it. That's how set theory works for him. It's not fundamental, it's nothing like this. It's like, it seems to me that axiomatic set theory does this. Let's see if it does. It does it very well, so let's stay with it. There's, let's say, the levels of determination or dependence in the concepts like being and appearing, they don't need to reflect on the tools that we need to analyze them. So you won't find in the correlation between set theory and category theory necessarily a relation that spells out something about the relation between being and appearing. Like, you want to think appearance, you have a philosophical decision on how to approach it. Pragmatically, category theory is useful for it. And it fits the very long list of conditions that to this point Badiou has imposed, because now we need to be compatible with being an event and so on and so forth. But you don't get to, let's say, it's kind of empty out of certain questions. So for example, the question of does being appear? I think depending on what you mean by being, it seems like a very kind of, you know, kind of a special moment kind of thing. But the fact that when you are going through the pages of a book, you can both think the number 145 and the relation of it to 144 in terms of how different they are for the book, right? But you can also think in terms of how different they are in their being, like as numbers. So both things are accessible. Appearance has nothing to do with hiding being, right?
Yeah, but you know, something that I found very interesting reading is the comparison. At some point, he compares the concept of the negative. I think we are still far from there. The discussion about the appearance of the negative, right?
Mm-hmm.
He talks about Kant, and he compares like the Kant's noumenon with the not presentation, but the inconsistent multiplicity, not the presented multiplicity, which is kind of interesting. I think in a sense it is interesting, but also it can create this kind of confusion. Like there is a concept of noumenon operative, like, you know, inconsistent multiplicity. You can't know what really is, all of that, right? And I think this warrants some kind of readings. For instance, if you get, you know, Ray Gracier's reading, he says like Badiou is a kind of a milder correlationist than Kant. It's like he's a correlationist like Kant, but much weaker in a sense. The fact that you can't really have an interpretation of Badiou like a two-world interpretation of Badiou, like you have a two worlds interpretation of Kant. Points to the fact that you know, the idea of the correlationism is much weaker in Badiou than in Kant. And I think Gabriel is pointing to the right direction when he says, no, you're actually participating in the thing you are. There's no inaccessibility because you take part in the stuff, but maybe you don't have knowledge by acquaintance, so to speak, in the Russell parlance. Knowledge by acquaintance with the supposed entities of, you know, this with inconsistent multiplicity as inconsistent multiplicities. Meaning, inconsistent multiplicities is not a matter of appearing; it's a matter of being, right? They make thinkable the participation in the situation, but you don't encounter them as being inconsistent multiplicities, devoid of any other properties they might have. You encounter them within a transcendental that makes up a world. So there's a subtle thing going on that can differentiate this account from, you know, a two worlds account, like that you get from certain readings of Kant. You know, you have the noumenon world and the world that we to which we have access and all of that, which is also I think a dodgy reading.
Yeah.
But I think there's some. But you himself makes the comparison in a sense. But it seems that to ask the question that we encounter being is to ask the question of how does being appear, and being appears within a transcendental that forms a world. So there you go. This is the theory of the appearance of this being, in a sense.
Yeah, you know, just to conclude before we go on, I think that there is something that is, again, another good principle to have in mind when reading Badiou. I just mentioned here that there's a weird statics of Badiou studies, and I think it has a lot to do with, let's say, the milieu where he was received, both by Lacanians and Heideggerians, post-Heideggerians, and so on. And there is this idea that was, I mean, a very important building block of continental philosophy, that you go from the world to being through an inconsistency in existence. So let's say it's a point of coincidence between the thinker and thought and ontology. Like you need to somehow force your own existential situation, and something appears that is not just situated, it's being itself. And I think Badiou takes the opposite route, which is to say, look, if you want to think beyond language, you don't need necessarily a paradoxical, inconsistent language. You can also mistreat language towards excessive consistency. So it's never about existentially letting go in order to open the space for something. It's always about constricting, contriving, coming up with this really kind of minimal but kind of hardcore approach, and then it thinks only that thing you want to think. So like if you want to think the being of numbers, you have access to it. It's just a specific thinking. There's no question about access to thinking in general, because there is no whole. I mean, it follows directly those two things. Like there is no question about access, truth, being. There is no general questions for this. Like you cannot pose these questions generally. I think that this whole discussion on the whole and the chimera, as he calls it, if you really take out from it its consequences, it's an absolute dethronement of philosophical questions. Like, not because he's saying it's all bad grammar, but he's saying like, you cannot pose these questions without knowing to which domain you're referring. There is no general question.
Yeah, this reminds me a lot of, existential questions, the way Carnap treats them. Like you have questions that are internal to the framework and questions that are external to the framework. Like this, for Carnap, it doesn't make sense to ask, does X exist? I mean, yeah, does X exist according to what framework, in a sense? So this reminds me a lot of this kind of treatment, this kind of analytic treatment, wherein you don't get you deflate these big metaphysical philosophical questions and localize them into certain pragmatic uses within certain frameworks in the case of Carnap, or certain worlds in the case of, or situations, or truth procedures in the case of Badiou, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think that this is really important to, I mean, if you want to get a very different answer to the question, why is mathematics ontology, just connect retroactively the discussion on the whole to the discussion on situation. If there is no whole, there are only situations, then mathematics needs to be a situation.
Yeah.
Again, it needs to be a contrived, restricted domain. That's what gives you access to something, not this kind of general question, right? So it's a weird kind of exercise also too. But sorry, just to, yeah.
Isn't that setting up a meta language of sorts though? Like either through the Carnap or through that interpretation of Badiou?
Yeah, Badiou has this philosophies providing that the meta ontology to the ontology that is mathematics. You get that in being an event, something like that. But it's not a meta language in the sense of Carnap, because it's not philosophy that's providing the construction. The construction is there, is mathematical, and it's participated in by the people who do mathematics, but philosophy gives, you know, the conceptual scaffolding in order to recognize that this is the ontological situation that is not available to the mathematician in a sense. But, so yes, there is like, there could be like a kind of meta level, but they are not, they don't have the same function as a meta language has in Carnot,
Yeah.
which is constructive, right? It's constructing the object language.
Yeah, it's a meta language which doesn't want to have an object language. By definition, it's only meta because it has no object. But anyway, we should.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Great questions, thank you.
Great. So we are on the first section of the intro. We should continue following the course. We shouldn't jump to actual book, should we?
I think we should continue following, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
Let's follow, we're not in a hurry, are we?
Okay. So this first section is after forcing thought to accept that every situation of being, every world, far from being reduced to the multiple, to the pure multiple, which is not nonetheless its being as such, contains a transcendental organization. This is an instance where the question of extensionality versus intentionality will come to fore. We shall see whether the transcendental organization adds any qualitative determination to a word whereby a formula can announce a word over and top of its constituents. As in Kant, there is a problem of possibility at stake. How is it possible that the neutrality, inconsistency, and indifferent dissemination of being qua being comes to consist as being there? Or how can the essential unbinding of multiple being give itself as a local binding and, in the end, as the stability of words? Why and how are the words rather than mere chaos? But there is a difference between Badiou's approach to this possibility and the idealist approach, in whose ages the powers of a transcendental subject are invoked to aid with metaphysics so it can make sense of the mess of cosmos. The idealism since Descartes has called upon the subject not as a problem, but as a solution to the aporia of the one. The world is nothing but formless multiplicity, but there exists a unified design of this world. Thus, transcendental is altogether anterior to every subject constitution. It is an imminent given of every given situation. Transcendental is what imposes upon every situation situated multiplicity, i.e. every world, the constraint of a logic, which is also the law of its appearing, or the rule with which the there of being there allows multiple to come forth as essentially bound. The name transcendental bears witness to the insight that the thinking of being cannot on its own account for the word's manifestation. The intelligibility of this manifestation must be made possible by immanent operations that you stresses, and transcendental is the name for these operations. It remains a mystery at this time, though, that how the name of immanent operations is transcendental. The unpresentability of being does not mean unknownability. Badiou has stressed that point in being an event and has squashed any doubt that he is a Kantian in disguise. Unpresentability of being qua pure multiplicity has to do with the operation of Kant as one as the basis for any presentation. Mathematics is the thought that thinks being and its presentation. But this knowledge of being does not entail that of appearing. Contra Heidegger, the logic of appearing will show that there is no point to think of being apart from beings. Universe is the empty concept of being of the whole. From the non-existence of the whole, thereby the universe, it follows that since we show that there is no universe, it belongs to the essence of the world that are several worlds, since if there were only one, it would be the universe.
Let me see if there's anything. Yeah, well, he didn't get into the whole. There is, okay. Or just to not jump ahead, let's continue, sorry.
Okay. 2, exposition of the transcendental. This involves logical operations responsible for making coherence to appearing in a world. We say in a world because the term world is contentful. That is, a world is being there of a multiple that it's and its elements. Therefore, dissimilar to Newton's empty space, a world is defined by its content, akin to Leibniz's understanding of space. There are 3 operations. A minimum of appearance is given. B, the possibility of conjoining the values of appearance of 2 multiples and therefore of any finite number of multiples. C, the possibility of globally synthesizing the values of appearance of any number of multiples, even if there is an infinity of them. The section will conclude by deducting the correlation dependence, that is another name for causal bond or necessity. 3, the origin of negation, which you're talking about. The problem of negation is a difficult problem for every transcendental theory of being there. Thinking negation is not a problem, but how do we establish the being there of the negation? Kant, for whom appearing or phenomenality, in which everything presents itself to intuition under form of the object, knows no negation. Kant also has little difficulty in identifying negation on the side of the concept. There is the empty concept without object, which is to say that which, albeit coherent for thought, does not relate to any intuitable object. For example, the Kantian notion of the noumena. Also a concept that involves an inherent contradiction, for example, square circle, which makes any object impossible. In these 2 cases, the concept points to the absence of any object. Nothing appears, there is nothing there. It is being without being there. For example, the concept of noumena. But Kant wants to extend the question of negative to intuition. Kant speaks of pure forms of intuition, space and time, on their own, without manifold and thereby without object. He posits there are objects empty of a concept, that is, object designated by the concept of their lack alone. Here is what Kant says. Reality is something, negation is nothing, namely a concept of the absence of an object, such as a shadow or cold. Therefore, Kant's point perhaps is, at the level of intuition, negation is absence of an object, a privation, a lack. But why cold is more negative than warm, or dark than light? In contrast, Badiou thinks, insofar as appearing is concerned, appearing is always an affirmation of being there. If so, then what is the being there of negation? At first, we might think the nil degree of transcendental value might be considered as the apparent negation, but the nil value should be considered as non-apparent, not apparent negation. The difficulty is of making negation appear. This question has haunted philosophy from its origin. Based on the impossibility of the appearance of negation, Parmenides considered negation a mere fiction. Plato, on the other hand, took the appearance of negative entirely the case, the lie, the sophist, the Gorgias himself. So he set out to devise a category capable of grasping the being there of negation and not the Parmenidean prohibition, the non-being there of non-being. Badiou quotes a very dense passage from Timaeus that in a form of a fable deals with the origin of the being there of negation. In this account, ideas of same and other are conjoined in the substance of the soul of the world, and this is performed by force, referring the origin of being there to an irrational moment of the narration. Sartre's solution is elegant. Negation appears because only the nothing grounds the fact that there is appearing. This is a profound idea that, as we shall see in the section on Hegel, is already in Science of Logic. The idea is while ontology, the realm in which thought is concerned with presentative form, is concerned primarily with identity, logic, the realm where thought is concerned with appearing or appearance, is concerned primarily with difference. The line we shall follow consists in basing the logical possibility of negation in appearing without thereby positing the negation as such appears. In effect, the concept suited to the apparent will not be in a given world its negation, but what we will call its reverse. Three properties of reverse. One, the reverse of being there is another being there in the world. The reverse of being there has nothing in common with that being there. The reverse of a degree of appearance is not necessarily identical to that degree. The union of an apparent and its reverse is not necessarily equal to the measure of the appearance of the world. This makes the concept of reverse an exception of the expansion of the thinking of negation. Classical negation is a particular case of this reverse.
Man, I just realized something. You know, Badiou likes to compare his books to Hegel books. So he says, Logics of Worlds is just my science of logic, and being an event was the phenomenology of spirit. I think he says something like this, right? But it makes no sense. The actual good comparison is doctrine of being is being an event, doctrine of essence is logics of worlds, and doctrine of concept is immanence of truth. Like it fits, right. Yeah, it fits perfectly. It fits much better.
Yeah, it's much better. I didn't read Immanence of Truth yet, but I mean.
No, but it's about the absolute, for fuck's sake. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Also, that's right. Okay, that's good. That's good.
That's
good.
Good.
One thing that I'm missing a little bit in your account, Reza, I think it should be mentioned, is that the transcendental is something that asks for an ordered, has to be ordered, right? I mean, you say that, but it's not that explicit when you say, you know, that there is a minimum degree of appearance. That means you have an order of degrees, right? So everything he's saying has to do with the fact that you can measure this order. You have different indices of appearing to different, I don't know, objects or things. Let me say it, things in a very, very broad sense of that participate in a particular world, right? Mm-hmm. And then the concept of negation gets defined not as the appearance of the negative per se, but the appearance of this reverse, which is a certain being there that has a certain value in relationship to another being there in the same world, because you have this ordered sequence of how do you call it in English? I'm reading in French. It's fucking me over with this these discussions because I have all the French names in mind. Sorry, but
yeah. In English?
Don't remember now. I mean, yeah, it's not an ordered sequence. What is
ordered structure?
Ordered structure, right? It's not a sequence, right?
Just one thing that I think it's good to mention also that connects to this point, but it's just that in the exposition of the Transcendental, you have like in 3 or 4 paragraphs a very condensed view of why you arrive at the thinking of transcendentals in terms of orders, because he says, okay, being there concerns the appearance in a world, and then he says it's not in, because actually the coherence is the world. There is no, you're not occupying a place. Yeah, the way you occupy is the place, right? Yeah. And that's what lead him to say, okay, but if the coherence is to look at the operation of coherence is to look at the constitution of the world itself. That's how you get to the problem of
and the world in that sense is constituted by the beings there, right? There's no there before the being there. Being there.
Exactly.
This is when he compares it to the Newtonian concept of space, like, you know, the whole correspondence with Clarke, where Newton defends the concept, the conception that there's an empty space wherein you can put in objects like that, and Clark defends like the Leibnizian conception that space is generated through the relationship of objects. So he's comparing to the idea of Newtonian space and actually criticizing it in the sense that this is not what he's aiming at. I mean, the worlds are not like containers wherein you put stuff. And this is why you have to have an ordered structure to the transcendentals that is constituting the appearings that compose a world.
Yeah,
right?
I'm actually the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I think this is one of the really big, profound points of the first book, which is that by the end of it, he showed equivalence between transcendental, a topological, and an algebraic definition of being there. So it's good because what he's saying here, like, don't approach the idea of being there in terms of there is a place and stuff on the place, because the coherence is just another way of talking about the placing, which is just another way of talking about the evaluation of differences. Like, those two things are equivalent. They didn't need to be equivalent. The idea that the most general possible description of a world is also one where placing, difference, and order are equivalent in some sense, that's actually quite profound. It's not like he actually gets from one thing to the other here. He criticizes one notion of placement and he extracts from it the idea that, okay, so we're talking about order. And
this is why transcendental is immanent in this sense, which is a question that Reza asks in his presentation. Transcendental is immanent because of that, because it is how to say that, the very fact that there are degrees of appearing is that which composes a world, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to get out of my head this idea. If I can just share my screen for 1 second here, like something like this. Like, this is how I imagined it. Like, you have a set, and then you have kind of like something that evaluates, like a ruler here, that evaluates stuff that's here on this set, right? You guys, please, I'm not having an aneurysm. It's just that I'm trying to draw with my finger. Like this idea that you have something that is added to the.
I mean, you are comparing the degrees of appearance to this ruler. It's like there's this ruler that it goes there.
Yes,
and
like the order structure is something other than. Yeah.
Okay.
And that would be the case if the transcendental and the placement were not two ways of talking about the same thing. If the inner coherence and the ordering were not, and that's where I went with kind of my sorry, Reza, sorry for borrowing the screen. That's what I thought he meant at first. And then when I realized how in the actual formal machinery with algebraic topology and so on, the whole point is that these are actually equivalent descriptions of something. And that this description where something is transcendentally, in the more classical sense, defined and structured, and the internal coherence, they're actually equivalent, kind of unhinges a bit this view. And I also think it goes back to that, it makes it easier to understand that there is nothing inaccessible. You're not like in a glass dome when you are in a world, right? It's not really what's at stake.
Should we continue?
Yeah.
Okay, I think this was the end of introduction. So we go to section 1, the concept of transcendental. Number 1, inexistence of the world. The inexistence of the world is the starting point of the transcendental logic. The concept of the whole inconsists. The thought of whole is inconsistent, and therefore the whole cannot be. We should note the fundamental equivalence that if a concept is incoherent, it cannot be. Inconsistency is not non-being. Being is consistent. What Badiou sets out to do in this section is to show that since the concept of whole leads to contradiction or a sort of indecision, the whole cannot be. First, let's find out what is involved in the concept of whole, of the whole, and what is it that Badiou is trying to refute. First, if the whole is, it must be thought in its being as pure in multiplicity. The whole is a multiple. What is the whole multiple of? Is the multiple of all there is. It is the multiple of all multiples. It counts everything as one. But the condition for the whole to be such an all-containing multiple is to contain itself too, or otherwise there is one thing that is not in the whole itself. We will call reflexive a multiple which has the property of presenting itself in its own multiple composition. Adopting an entirely classical reasoning, we have just said that if the being of the whole is presupposed, it must be presupposed as reflexive, or that the concept of universe entails with regard to its being the predicate of reflexivity. In the whole, now we have two types of multiples that are reflexive and multiples that are not reflexive. It is the case since at least the whole is reflexive. Let's W be the whole and let's A be the subset of all elements of W that are not reflexive, and B is the set of all elements in W that are reflexive. We note that A is a subset of W and B is a subset of W, and A union B is equal to W, and A conjunction with B is empty, i.e. A and B partition W with no remainder and with no shared elements between the two. It is clear that since W is the set of all multiples, we can also say that A is an element of W, and the same for B. Since A is an element of W, it is relevant for us to ask whether A is reflexive or not. If it is not, then A is an element of A. But that is a contradiction because A is the set of all non-reflexive elements of W. And if A is reflexive, then the contradiction of A belongs to A, which means that A is non-reflexive. Therefore, A should belong to A as a non-reflexive set. So A can be neither reflexive nor non-reflexive, and since W permits no remainder between these two partitions, A has no being. Now from A having no being, we have to conclude W to have no being. Here is what Badiou says. But its being followed necessarily from the being that was ascribed to the whole. Therefore, the whole has no being. Badiou has shown W implies A and not A, and from these, he concludes not W. This syllogism is valid based on modest tolerance. After this determination, Badiou asked the question whether such demonstration was even necessary for refuting the being of the whole. It seems that his answer is affirmative at the end. We must use a proof such as the above to refute the whole. In the end, the question of the whole, which is logical or ontological, in essence enjoys no physical or phenomenological evidence. It calls for an argument, the very one that mathematics discovered at the beginning of the 20th century and which we have reformulated here. But what was the alternative to the proof proof that Badiou considered? He mentions that the conception of the whole resembles the outdated ancient conception of the cosmos, which envisaged it as the beautiful and finite totality of the world. But this vision of cosmos was that Alexander Koyré showed to change under Galilean epistemological break and replace it with the notion of the infinite universe, which is based on Euclidean infinity of space and its isomorphic neutrality of what inhabits it. However, Badiou argues that the latter shift in viewing the cosmos from finite to infinite, pre and post Galileo, faced serious objections. First, this shift only speaks about scientific point of view of the cosmos and not ontological view. What Badiou targets in the argument that being as such doesn't form a whole, and the fact that the question of the limits of the visible universe is but a secondary aspect of the ontological question of the whole. Secondly, the cosmological viewpoint has gone through yet a complete reversal since Galileo. Under general relativity and its offshoot, the theory of Big Bang, both in terms of phenomenal dimensions of cosmos, i.e. time and space, the universe is finite. It has an origin in time, and it's closed into itself in space. And ultimately, what is finite could be whole. At the end, as mentioned above, Badiou thinks that the concept of the whole can be only refuted using a logical argument, not a cosmological or scientific argument. The immediate consequence of the existence of non-existence or inexistence of the whole is that the only truth is the local truth, that is local to each world. So I pause here if you have a comment.
First is that I love I love how he moves from the cosmological argument to like a small logical argument to get here. But I think it's also a good point where you get Badiou making a clear statement that when he discusses ontology, he's not discussing the real in the sense of what's out there. Ontology really is not about what's out there, right? Which I'm more and more kind of inclined to this weird idea, and I think that it might find support in Badiou's philosophy, that for Badiou, you have 5 modal categories: contingency, necessity, impossibility, possibility, and thinkability, as if to be thinkable is like to be possible, you know, it's something different. Because ontology for him, he claims this more than once, there is no modality at stake in ontology. Because it's true, it's not really, it's not statements about possibility in the like, you need to arrive at possibility, you need to arrive at the conditions of a particular world. So what sort of modality do we have for this kind of there is no whole kind of thing? It's a weird, it's not a necessity because it's not applying to a certain world and saying if this follows from everything and everything follows from this. It's something else. And the more I try to take seriously this idea that ontology is a weird small situation where, because you've restricted your means so much, you can't say much about anything, but you can make statements about what follows from there being, from something belonging to something else, right? Very small number of yeah, exactly. So for one point, you get this kind of ontological argument concerning the universe, but it's not physics, right? And I think that it's important to realize that we are, let's say, for Badiou, physics is a theory of a certain class of worlds. It's not a theory of being, right? And we lost nature in between being and appearing here as a kind of general category. Already dismissed it before. But I love this weird way of dismissing Galileo and Poiret's reading of Galileo to stick to Cantor as this guy's 10-page book on, it's not 10-page book, but like 50-page work on infinity is more of an empirical evidence of the infinity of the universe than Galileo's work on physics.
And I agree with him. Okay, continue.
Sure.
2, derivation of the thinking of a multiple on the basis of that of another multiple. In this section, Badiou begins to differentiate logic of multiples from ontology of multiples. The first move is to set the difference in the operator of identity. Identity of a multiple in ontology is nothing but its composition, the axiom of extension. That means that the multiple that has no element makes itself immediately determined. It is the void. All other multiple in ontology are determined in a mediated way through the decimation of their constituent multiples to determine their identities respectively. Therefore, the thinkability of all multiples in ontology, i.e. their identity, is through one single multiple in ontology, the void. This also means that identity is the result of an operation, the operation of recursive decimation of all constituent multiples. This operation is guaranteed to exist for all multiples. It is just the reverse of the membership relationship, i.e. it breaks down a multiple to the members that belong to that multiple, so on and so forth. It also means that means the following. Ultimately, it is clear that every thinkable being is drawn from operations first applied to the void alone. A multiple will be all the more complex the longer the operation chain, which on the basis of the void leads to its determination. The degree of complexity is technically measurable. This is the theory of ontological rank. The absence or the impossibility of the whole means that the way the identification of multiples must work is singular and local. In another word, if the whole had existed, there must have been a count as one of all there is. The whole would have given us a place of identity, each multiple through properties that singularize each or predicative separation that would uniformly determine each multiple or group of multiples. Since the whole is not such a global, i.e. top-down predicative operation, predicative operation is not available. Such top-down predicative operation is not available. Hence, the identification must only rely on the multiple itself. This is the sense of local versus global. The identity of the multiple cannot rely on something that is outside of the multiple, global to the multiple, but inside the multiple, local to the multiple. What about differentiation of multiples? Does ontology provide a separate operation that given two multiples, it says whether they are different? The axiom of extension provides a procedure according to which if two multiples are defined in the same way, then they are identical. How about determining the two multiples are different? Difference is not a separate operation in ZFC. If two multiples are not the same, they are different, i.e. difference is defined as the negation or the lack or the privation of sameness. This, as we shall see more clearly later, establishes that our ontology is Parmenidean, a Parmenidean paradigm, absence of the operation of difference, whereas logic is a Platonist paradigm, inclusion of the operation of difference. In the end, there is no possible uniformity among the derivations of the thinkability of multiples, nor a place of the other in which they should all be situated. The identifications and relations of multiples are always local. Let's give an example. Let's say X is a multiple consisting of multiples A, B, and C. C equal to X, A, B, and C. Let's say Y also contains the same multiples. According to the axiom of extension, we have X equal to Y. Now, if we consider another multiple Z with the following composition, PQAB, since composite parts of Z is not the same as X, we say X not equal to Z, or X and Z are different. What can we say about A or B as multiples? It is evident that according to what was said, the definition of A has no dependence on the definition of X, Y, or Z. Definition or identification of A is only dependent on its constituent multiples, which hasn't been shown in this example. This also goes for B and C. None of these elements for their identities depend on each other or depends on to whose composition they enter. Ontology only stipulates that the identity of a multiple to be dependent on its composition, not any other multiple. This is the radical sense of locality that is embedded in the demands of ontology. Therefore, a multiple's identity is defined locally in relation to the other multiples that enter its determination, like A, B, and C that enter the determination of X. We call a multiple a being that is determined locally in relation to other multiples. We call a world a light within which a multiple can be determined. In this case, a world consisting of multiples X, A, B, and C. In other words, in the context of the operations of thought, whereby the identity of a multiple is guaranteed on the basis of its relation with other multiples, we call being the multiple thus identified and world relative to operations in question, the multiple place in which these operations operate. We will also say that the identified multiple is a being of the world.
Sorry I'm late, by the way. I just need to add something to this section. One thing that's missing here, I think, is that difference is reflexive in the appearance, right? So you can be different from yourself, whereas in ontology, sets can't be different from themselves by extension because they have the same elements, right?
In appearing, that is correct.
Yeah, in appearing, you can be self-different. So that's
yeah. But I think that since but you establishes this in the next section, because at this point he only said that you need local definitions, like you need to localize yourself on the basis of the multiple you're in. You cannot localize yourself based on a global measure. But then when he goes into the next session, he'll make that distinction between differing from itself and differing from other beings.
I remember that he does say that, but I don't remember whether he said that here or the next section. But
it's on the next section,
yeah.
It's on this.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
But it's
yeah.
It seems like it should be there, but it's added at the end on page 117. It's a bit later.
Ah, okay. So this is the section basically reiterating the axiom of separation.
Yeah,
right.
I think this is the section where he just extracts, he connects this idea of localization to the idea of difference, right? Not even difference. He doesn't even talk about difference.
Yeah, because in this first section, he establishes there's no whole, which corresponds in ontology to basically the axiom of foundation, I guess, or axiom of separation. Mm-hmm. And then, but in this one, he says that, okay, since there is no whole, every multiple must be derived from another multiple.
Yeah, there is no uniform procedure of identification.
Yeah, so the first section is inexistence of whole. The second section is the principle of identity. And I think the third section is the principle of difference.
Yes, I would say like he had a negative statement on globality. Now he makes a positive statement about locality, identity and locality. Like it's local identification. There's no global identification. And then on the third section, he makes a statement on difference.
Okay, should we continue?
Yep.
Okay. 3, a being is thinkable only insofar as it belongs to a world. The thinkability of every being other than the void depends on 3 things. Another being whose being is guaranteed and thereby thinkable, an operation that allows for going from that being to the being whose being is to be thinkable, and a space for the operation of passage. With the absence of the whole, a global space for all passages we have seen above, how this space is a local. We are guaranteed one point in this place. The other being or other beings on the basis of which the operation or operations give access to the identity of the new being. And the being which is thus guaranteed in its being names another point within the place. Between these 2 points lies the operational passage, which the place as such as its background, with the place as such as its background. So although it is the operation that identifies the being, the locality of this operation is determined by the space of the operation, what we call the world. So world is a situation of being that gives access to a local procedure of identifying a being in the world. A being abstractly determined in its being as pure multiplicity can appear in different worlds. There is no intrinsic link between a given multiple and a given world. The worlding of a pure multiple, its appearing or its being there, is a logical operation. It is the operation of identity in a particular world that guarantees its identity. Similarly, the same pure multiple can appear in several worlds, all of whom have their local guarantee for the identity of the being there of that multiple in the world. Here we come to a point that Badiou brought up in the introduction, the point around which he compared the inquiry in logic of world to Kant's inquiry about the possibility of what we know for the fact, and that is the fact of appearing is possible. In Badiou's words, knowing that being qua being, as described in being an event, is indifferent and incoherent multiplicity, how could we explain the coherent and consistent being there? Why there are words rather than mere chaos? This is the inquiry Badiou is after. Now that we have established that there is no whole, established logically, i.e. the concept of the whole inconsists and thereby cannot have a being, and therefore the determination of being is local with respect to the relation of a being to be determined with an already determined being and a certain set of operations that derive being from determined being. The question is how any determination can be accomplished. The answer, as just mentioned, cannot be that the determination is accomplished within the space provided by the whole, since the whole is not. Hence, now we know the local determination is possible. There are determinate beings. This must be that there must be worlds that provide the space for these determinations of beings. I mean, this is important, I think, from the perspective that we said earlier, that from the fact of appearing, we are deriving a logic that makes appearing possible. But worlds are different things. There is no one world, or that would be the whole. From this, we conclude that determinations take place within each world. Does this mean a multiple that is ontologically the same multiple is determined each time according to the world within which it is placed? Yes. That means the being there of a multiple in a world is not the same as its being qua being, which is the same multiple. This is how Badiou says that a multiple ontologically and logically are two different thoughts. Additionally, a multiple being ontologically is different from other multiple beings that are share the same world with that multiple being. They are also different. So at the end, being there for a multiple being in a world boils down to two crucial differences: difference from itself and difference from other beings of the same world. Because this is such a crucial moment in Badiou's deduction, we should recite a long and beautiful passage that he captures these points. Should I read this?
Sure.
It is therefore certain that the identity of a being grasped in the efficacy of its appearing includes something other than the ontological or mathematical construction of its multiple being. But what? The answer is a logic through which every being finds itself constrained and deployed once it appears locally, and its being is accordingly affirmed as being there. What does it really mean for a singular being to be there? once its being a pure mathematical multiplicity, does not prescribe anything about this there to which it is consigned. It necessarily means the following. A, differing from itself, being there is not the same as being qua being. It is not the same because the thinking of being qua being does not envelope the thinking of being there. B, differing from other beings of the world, of the same world, being there is indeed this being, which ontologically is not an other, and its inscription with others in this world cannot abolish this differentiation. On one hand, the differentiation identifier of a being cannot account on its own for the appearing of this being in a world, but on the other hand, the identity of a world can no more account on its own for the differentiated being of what appears. The key to thinking appearing when it comes to a singular being lies in being able to determine at one and the same time the self-difference, which makes it so that being there is not being qua being, and difference from others, which makes it so that being there or the law of the world, which is shared by these others, does not abolish the being qua being. If appearing is a logic, it is because it is nothing but the coding of these differences word by word. This, Badiou says, this, Badiou says, further imposes the transcendental degree of sameness and difference. Or his own word, the logic of appearing necessarily regulates degrees of differences or difference of a being with respect to itself and the same with respect to others. It is not clear to me how Badiou, from the two principles of difference, concludes the discussion of degree of sameness and difference. The appearing of the multiple being is not chaotic, he says, since it is logically regulated by these degrees. More of this discussion of degrees will come further down.
One thing that I like about this passage you selected, though I really like the other passage on this section as well, the one that he talks about how the human animal is kind of envious of the void. I like that. It's a nice passage. But what I like about this is that you get, for a moment, you get a kind of gradual vision that moves from being and appearing, where, well, the more you differ from it, the more when you talk about something, you're not talking about it, you're talking, it's different from itself, you're entering its place in a world, and the more it is like itself, right? And it is, I mean, differing from yourself and differing from others removes you from ontology and brings you to the thinking of a particular world. But if you now come to a world where, in a world where you don't differ from yourself, and that you not differing from yourself is how you distinguish yourself from others, you're already at the world of ontology. So you can, from this definition of being there, based on these two differences, if you now go to, let's say, the new point of this difference, you are back at ontology, but from the perspective of a world, right? The world where when you think something, you're thinking it in its sameness, and not its difference from itself. And its sameness is precisely what distinguishes it from others. That's the world of ontology.
Yeah, so you're saying it's a generalization that can has the same, if we want to constrain it, it can support the same logic of ontology. Let's say it's strong enough to express ontology, but it is more general than ontology.
Yes, and I think that this is, I mean, I'm cheating here because in Immanence of Truth, but there's a very funny section called Self-Critique, where he says, you know, guys, I made this distinction between ontology and logic, and it's all very good, but I can just define ontology as the world that deals with the existence of one relation, right? Which is belonging. So he does that. He goes further. I wanted to find it here, but it's just lost on me. Where he
While
says
you're
it.
trying to find it, I think he says it very explicitly later on that we had one operation by Parmenides, that was identity. Now we have another operation which is difference. So now we have two operations. So that's why logic is a superset of ontology.
Mm-hmm. And you can still constrain it back. You can talk about the world of ontology. Just as you could about the situation of ontology. There is nothing contradictory there.
From a Platonist world, you can easily go back to a Parmenidean world.
Yeah, though I wonder if his definition, I mean, doesn't this kind of contradict the idea that ontology is mathematics, because mathematics can support many more relations than just belonging.
Yeah, but you know, like this is, we were talking about this before you arrived, like it's first that recently, I'm not sure if you saw his lecture in Prague from, I think 2 years ago, where he annoyed some of his students because he said, look, guys, this thing about mathematics and ontology, like, don't take it so seriously, you know? Like, he gives a very different approach to it, which I think it's much more acceptable, much more easy to digest, which is, you know, I decided philosophically being must be a pure multiple. Then I looked for the form of thinking that could work through this hypothesis, right? It's not like mathematics in general is ontology. There is a definition prior to this, and then he went to the part of mathematics that can express pure multiplicity and so on. So I don't think he's committed to, let's say, I mean, even if he were committed to that distinction, right? The fact that category theory is precisely, let's say, the big recasting of logic inside mathematics already makes this this move not a move of shifting from mathematics to something else, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could say that category theory is just how the world of mathematics perceives worlds as such, right? Logics of worlds. In the same way that, like, there's no logics of worlds that's abstractly sitting above all the worlds. You have the logics of worlds that is part of a world.
Yeah.
Which you could say, yeah, it's category theory, for example.
Yeah, there's no, I mean, I think this is, Badiou is like the greatest, the most kind of paradoxical postmodern guy. There's absolutely nothing which is not situated. There's nothing which is unsituated. Everything is situated. Even the theory of situations is a situation. And what I just wanted to show you that, I mean, I think he explores in more detail, or he accepts with more ease later on, this recasting of set theory as, let's say, a particular class of structures in category theory defined by the belonging relation, right? But the fact that set theory itself can be recasted in this way doesn't take anything away, right, from it.
Yeah, there's no sharp distinction, there.
Yeah, I just wanted to find him making this self-critique, but I lost it here. I don't know where
But on that topic, that Dennis was saying that other relations other than belonging exist in mathematics. Obviously there are, but the only primitive relationship that exists in set theory is belonging. I think what he's saying here, that in order for us to think appearance, we need another primitive, which is difference. So of course you can think identity without the primitive, which is the realm of ontology, without the primitive of difference. But when it comes to appearance, you need another primitive. And hence what Plato added to Parmenides, which is the next section actually. We can talk about this some more after reading the next section, which I love.
Mhm.
It's a very nice section.
Yeah, no, let's continue. I didn't want to.
Okay.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Number 4, appearing and the transcendental. Appearing is thus the situating of mathematical, i.e. pure multiple in a relational network, a world that acts as a local space for the possibility of thinking that mathematical multiple. Furthermore, a thinkability implies both identity and difference, i.e. to arrive to the thinking of the multiple in the world will imply to arrive to the difference of the multiple with others. Thinking of the multiplicity in the world is to also think its difference with others in the world. Thirdly, appearing is not about identity and difference as binary relations, but degrees as well as relation and context, i.e. same multiple may appear in a world on its or its different subworlds in different ways. Day 360 of the year and page 360 of this book are both appearing of the same mathematical multiple 360. Their degree of identity can thus be compared to the identity of day 360 of the year and day 361 of the year, although they are the appearance of different mathematical multiples in the world. Appearing is thus a regime that is under a logic, or we would more refer to it as algebra, which Badiou calls it the transcendental logic or algebra, that provides the operations through which the identities and differences of worldly appearing can be measured and calculated. Now we have this long quote. Unless we suppose that appearing is chaotic, I love this quote, a supposition dispelled at once by the undeniable existence of thinking of beings, there must be a logic for appearing, capable of linking together in the world evaluations of identity, which are no longer supported by the rigid extensional identity of pure multiples, that is, by being in itself. As we know immediately, every world pronounces upon degrees of identity and difference, without there being any acceptable reason to believe that these degrees, insofar as they are intelligible, what's the existence of the human animal. We know from an indisputable precedes the existence of our species, and that, just like our world, it is stipulated identities and differences and had the power to deploy the appearing of the innumerable beings. This is what Quentin Meillassoux calls the fossils argument, the irrefutable materialist argument that interrupts the idealist and empiricist apparatus of consciousness and the object. The world of dinosaurs existed, it deployed the infinite multiplicities of beings, millions of years before it could be a question of a consciousness or subject, empirical as well as transcendental. To deny this point is to front a rampant idealist axiomatic. It is clear that there is no need of a consciousness to testify that beings are obliged to appear, that is, to abide there under the logic of a world, appearing through irreducible to pure being, which is accessible to thinking only through mathematics, is nonetheless what beings must endure once the whole is impossible. I think this is very important. I read this sentence again. Appearing through irreducible, thou reducible to pure being, which is accessible to thinking only through mathematics, is nonetheless what beings must endure once whole is impossible, in order to their being to be guaranteed. Being must always manifest themselves locally, without any possible recollection of the innumerable words of this manifestation. The logic of a world is what regulates this necessity by affecting a being with a variable degree of identity and consequently of difference to the other beings of the same world. The appearance of pure multiples is what the being of the multiples guaranteed. Without them having to appear, there is no guarantee for their being. And their guarantee is not a guarantee that is issued by a conscious being. So a being is a being insofar as it appears, despite of us having the ability to recognize its pure being from its appearing. But you says this guarantee of being is appearing is a consequence of the non-being of the whole. How's that? If the whole were, that is, if it had logical consistency and therefore ontological being, all being would have been inscribed in it. As they are, that is, ontologically their being are within the whole. And there was no need for them to appear, since the whole would have provided the space for the required operation for their determination. In fact, the experience of appearance of beings in and of itself perhaps is another argument for the non-being of the whole. Furthermore, not having the whole would also mean that the appearing of pure beings is infinite in number, disjoint and local. Beings must manifest themselves locally without any possible recollection of the innumerable worlds in which their manifestation occur, i.e., there is no relation between each manifestation. Therefore, because of the non-being of the whole, multiple, i.e., mathematical pure beings manifest infinitely many times in a world or infinitely in many worlds, so that they have infinite manifestations both in a world and infinitely many worlds. Furthermore, the appearing of a being is irreducible to the being itself. This is so because in every world there are infinitely many manifestations of the same mathematical multiplicity or multiple. For example, number 360 in the example above. These infinitely many manifestations are made possible because the appearing of a pure multiple isn't the same as the multiple in itself, as we saw in the previous section. Appearing is that which provides a context for a being to impose its to be, or to be determined because a guaranteed multiple becomes a guaranteed multiple. This context, however, itself imposes something back, a network of relationship in which the to be of the being is made possible. For the pure being of mathematical multiple 360, the pages of the book provides such a network for the being of this pure multiple to impose its being. But the network of relationship that constitutes the physicality of a book makes the to be of number 360 to appear in a way conducive to a word we call they or this book. This goes with the comment number 360 in the same book. Same pure multiple under a different network of appearance inscribed within the same world allows the to be of the pure multiple, that is number 360, to appear differently. Appearing is thus what beings do in a local network of relations, acting as the space in which beings to be is manifested as appearing. I think it is clear that Badiou does not concern himself with the question of why appearing is something beings must do. His inquiry is different. He says that given that there is appearing, what are the conditions for appearing to take place? His premises are few. The whole is not. There is no global space for being of beings, a sort of inscription that acts as a global guarantor of the being of everything there is. Being of beings is always in spaces that are local, dispersed, and disconnected. This space is called the world. There is a division between being qua being of a multiple being and its being there, whose being there is always in a world. The latter is called appearing. Appearing of a multiple being is irreducible to its being and is local. Since appearance is not reducible to pure being, it must be a matter of degree. How identical or different an appearance is to or from the pure multiple, and how identical or different an appearance is to another appearance. Transcendental is what measures in each word the degree of sameness or difference of two appearances. Quote, every being is in a world only to the extent that it is indexed to this transcendental. First of all, in a given world, what is the degree of identity of a being to another being in the same world? Furthermore, what happens in the world to the identity of a being to its own being? the transcendental organization of the world is the protocol of response to these questions. Badiou's example of the opera seems to suggest the analogy of a world to language and the transcendental of a world to a grammar of the language. His example of the opera suggests that by studying a world, we gradually learn the transcendental of the world, which is like learning an old language by studying the sentences and words, etc. Transcendental belongs to a world, and as the note 3 above, which was being of beings is always in spaces that are local, dispersed, and disconnected. This space is called a world. A world is local space for appearing. Hence, the transcendental of a world only belongs to the world. There is no inter-world transcendental such as the way it is for Kant, whose transcendental operation of subjects, understanding, and cognition are universal. It is therefore clear in what sense we call transcendental that which authorizes a local or intra-worldly evaluation of identities and differences. To grasp the singularity of this usage of the word transcendental, we should note that, as in Kant, it concerns a question of possibility, but also that we are also dealing with local dispositions and not with a universal theory of differences. To put it very simply, there are many transcendentals. The intra-worldly regulation of difference is itself differentiated. This is one of the main reasons why it is impossible here to argue from a unified center of transcendental organization, such as the subject is for Kant. The point here is this. We say how by abolition of the whole, pure being is necessarily different than appearing, or what amounts to the same, appearing is irreducible to pure being, and how this difference brings about the need to think about identity and difference of appearing in a whole new light. This is in the same way that appearing is irreducible to pure being, identity and difference of an appearing to another is different to the identity of mathematical being to another. How is that? We know the issue of identity in mathematics is purely a matter that is regulated by the axiom of extension. This axiom unveils a precise operation for establishing of the identities of two multiples, but that is it. That is, there is no extra provision in this axiom to establish the difference of two multiples. Two multiples are different simply when they are not the same, i.e. the exhaustive and iterative process of comparing the multiples cannot show that they are the same. In our example, however, 360 degrees Celsius and 360th day of the year and page 360 of this book are all appearing of the number 360. How are they the same as this multiple in itself? How are they the same to each other? And are they more the same than page 359 and page 360 of this book? The axiom of extension cannot answer these questions. Badiou augments the above lines of thought with an amazing anecdote from the history of philosophy itself, which happens to be the first transcendental move in philosophy. In this anecdote, one thing can be perceived. Parmenides operated at the level of ontology alone. Plato's departure from Parmenides was precisely the same departure we are trying to justify here. When he started questioning how ideas, for example, the ideas of movement and rest, and the singleton operator of the same could account for the phenomenon of the being of what is not same, i.e. different. A possible solution to rely upon a third great idea inherited from Parmenides, which seems to address the problem of difference. This is the idea of the same, which supports the operation of the identification of beings. Ideas included, and being whatever is the same as itself. Couldn't one say that movement and rest are different because the same does not subsume them simultaneously? It is at this point that Plato makes a remarkable decision, a truly transcendental decision. He decides that difference cannot be thought as the same because of identity. the simple absence of identity. It is in the wake of this decision, in the face of its ineluctable consequences, the existence of non-being, that Plato breaks with Parmenides. Contrary to what is argued by the Eleatic philosopher, the law of being makes it impossible for Plato to think difference solely with the aid of idea of the same. There must be a proper idea of difference, an idea that is not reducible to the negation of the idea of the same. Plato names this idea the other on the basis of this idea, saying that movement is other than rest involves an underlying affirmation in thought, that of the existence of the other, and ultimately that of the existence of non-being, instead of merely signifying the movement is non-identical to rest. Using the supergenre of same, Parmenides cannot think the difference between movement and rest. Using identity under the idea of same, movement is movement and rest is rest. We will never know movement is not rest. Here Plato decided to add another supergenre, other. In thinking movement with rest, we are affirming of the being of the idea other. So thinking difference is an affirmation, which ultimately means that negation is not a non-being, but itself a being. The latter, the existence of non-being, is what separated Plato from Parmenides. It is in this same way that Kant introduces the transcendental law of the subject. The in itself cannot account for the world of phenomena. We need a new operator, the transcendental subject. In the same way, as said before, the determination of a multiple being in ontology, i.e. set theory, we could argue follows a Parmenidean paradigm. It only has the axiom of extension, which is an operator of identity. There is no operator of difference in set theory. Now, Badiou argues that this is not enough when it comes to thinking of beings, which is an empirical fact. The operator of identity alone is not enough. We need additional operator that measures difference in two ways: difference with itself and difference with others. In addition, this difference is not absolute and is a matter of degree. This is what this operator should be able to do. Badiou calls this operator the transcendental of the world. And in the same vein as Kant calls the laws of appearing the transcendental laws. It is curious how Badiou would assess Hegel's science of logic in this light, as it does not seem that Hegel has such a caesura in moving from being to appearing, from ontology to phenomenology. Although one can say this difference in Hegel is always embedded in the dialectic of being and nothing. More on this later.
Guys, I need to go like in 2 minutes, but I just wanted to remark something that I think is really crucial, and it should be a big topic when we come to the chapter on Hegel, which is that if you pay close attention, Badiou introduces a theory of measure, because a theory of transcendental is a theory of measurement. At exactly the same point, let's say he gives us an argument on infinity and totality, and then an argument concerning local measurement. That's exactly the same order of argumentation that in the science of logic we have the discussion on quantity and infinity, qualitative infinity, and then ratio and measure. And everything that you said here in the end, like there is no caesura in Hegel from being to appearing. Well, first he skips one caesura, because when he comes to infinity, he skips the problem of axiomatic, which he didn't have the connection between infinity and axiomatics. And then he needs measurement to do a lot, because he has a unified theory of measurement that leads to the problem of essence. So he's able to deduce the transcendental and its connection to appearance, because he kind of sutured or made a certain caesura disappear in the discussion of quantity and infinite and mathematical infinity, which is a big problem for him. So there, I mean, I'm giving a ridiculous kind of summary, but I just wanted to point out that it's very interesting how close the discussion actually is with science of logic at that point. Like the very argument is set up going through, I mean, quantity, the problem of of belonging, pure quantity, extension, set theory. Suddenly we arrive at the problem of differentiation, and then the argument towards infinity is what requires us to have local measurements for differentiation. It's just a very similar step, but he added axiomatic to clarify the relation between quantity and infinity, which is something Hegel didn't have access to. I mean, he actually kind of had, but he didn't do anything with it. And I think it would be interesting for us to compare later on how what is missing from Hegel's argument on mathematical infinity, he has to kind of trade or reinsert with his theory of measure, which I think is, I mean, the dialogue for me with Hegel in Badiou is with the theory of measure. It's not with the doctrine of essence. At this point, what's truly, let's say, the proto-transcendental in Hegel is the discussion of relation qua ratio and the appearance of the idea of measure as this sort of immanent detachment, right? Immanent ordering of the world by itself, of something by itself. So there is a very, very dense, very packed discussion that we could have on this point, which I think would be very interesting as well. Unfortunately, I have to run, but please continue, and I'll leave the meeting recording so I can listen to the rest.
I think we should stop here actually, because
No, I thought that we were stopping.
Okay, I just didn't want to impose anything.
We don't want to. We don't want you to miss anything.
For me, it's dense enough. I think there's a lot of to digest until next
Yeah, I'm
week.
gonna think about all of this. It's too much.
Yeah, I think Reza should